In this video, we're taking a look at Magnus Carlsen's all-time favorite opening, the Ruy Lopez, uncovering his tactical ingenuity and scintillating strategy in this opening. The first opponent is international master Azat Sharafiev. Magnus starts e4 and is faced with e5. Knight f3 pressures the pawn and knight c6 defends. Bishop b5 marks the Ruy Lopez. This move attacks the knight, undermining the defense of e5. The threat to take the knight, however, is merely an illusion since the capture would allow black to open the d-file, making it possible to meet knight takes e5 with queen d4, forking the knight and e4 pawn. Still, bishop b5 is a good move because it develops the piece, prepares castling, and sets up a potential pin against black's king. Black replies with knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, so white defends with knight c3. Then black plays bishop d6, preparing to castle, and anticipating white's capture of the knight on c6 to remove the defense of e5 by defending the pawn with the bishop. Magnus follows with d3, opening his dark squared bishop, and black plays a6, asking the question to the bishop, who retreats to a4. After black castles, white charges the kingside with g4, but this is a free pawn, and black grabs it with the knight. Still, in return for the pawn, white just got a semi-open g-file, and he immediately takes advantage as he shifts his rook over to g1, hitting the knight, and indirectly targeting the black king. Black returns the knight to f6 before white swoops his bishop to g5, pinning it to the queen. So black breaks the pin, dropping his bishop to e7. With the bishop gone, however, Magnus snatches the knight on c6, removing the defender of the e5 pawn. After black recaptures with the d-pawn, white takes the pawn on e5. Black's queen springs to d4, hitting the knight, who returns to f3, counterattacking. Black slides the queen to b4, hitting the undefended b-pawn. So white shifts his queen to c1, defending. Black follows with rook e8, centralizing and defending the bishop just in case the knight wants to move. White's a3 kicks the queen back to b6, and white's queen jumps to f4, threatening to take the knight and the bishop after it would recapture, making use of the pin on the g-pawn to the king. So, black moves his king over to the corner out of the leering eyes of the white rook. White's b-pawn is hanging with the queen moved, so Magnus castles queenside, defending it while getting his king to safety. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop e6 before white swings his queen over to the h-file, peering at the enemy king. Black plays c5, starting his own attack on the queen side, but white's might just be a little bit faster as he raises his rook to g3 with ideas of both doubling rooks on the g-file or even creating a brutal battery along the h-file. Black drops his knight to g8, opening the bishops to one another, hoping to exchange pieces in order to dampen white's attack. White doesn't mind though, as he takes the bishop, and after the rook recaptures, he jumps his knight to g5, threatening checkmate on h7. Black's best choice is to push h6, stopping the threat, and he does just that. Magnus fires his f-pawn, preparing to cut off the bishop's vision down the kingside, and black pushes f6, attacking the knight. So it retreats to f3. Black advances his queen to a5, making way for the b-pawn to propel the pawn storm. Yet white beats him to the punch as the f-pawn advances, attacking the bishop. Going to f7 would be unwise since it cuts off the rook's lateral defense of the 7th rank. So it drops to d7 before white jumps his knight to d5, hitting the rook, who slides over to f7. White brings his last attacker as the rooks double up along the g-file. Black's b5 is a last-ditch effort at counterplay, but white's breakthrough comes first, and it all starts with the stunning sacrifice, knight takes f6. The rook cannot take the knight because it would hang the g7 pawn. Really, black just shouldn't take the knight at all, but his position is starting to fall apart at incredible speed. So he bites the bullet and takes it with the pawn, giving white a brilliant winning combination. Can you find white's checkmate in 7? With the white rook's dominant control over the g-file, paired with the fact that the black knight is the only defender of the h-pawn, it's no surprise that black's kingside is on the verge of collapse. The move Magnus plays to trigger its downfall is rook takes g8 check. This removes the defender of the h-pawn, and white's going to take that next. Now, black has the option to move the king to h7, but white would jump his other rook to g6, and black would have no way to stop queen takes h6 checkmate. So, black takes the rook, and white captures on h6 with check. The other black rook blocks, and white takes the pawn on f6, giving check once again. Black blocks again, putting his own rook into an unfortunate pin, and white's last move of the game is rook g6, threatening rook h6 checkmate, which prompts black to resign. The game could continue with black delaying things, starting with queen e1 check. White would take that, then black would take the pawn on f5, preparing to block the rook's check with the bishop, but white would take that too. Then black's next move wouldn't matter, rook h6 would be checkmate. The next opponent is billionaire Igor Tolchinsky, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with knight d4. Magnus takes the knight, and after black recaptures with the pawn, he drops his bishop back to c4, eyeing up the vulnerable f7 pawn. Black pushes c6, preparing to kick the bishop, and white castles. Black's wildly aggressive queen h4 draws near the enemy king while attacking the e4 pawn. White defends it with d3 while opening his queenside minor pieces. Black boosts his b-pawn, booting the bishop back to b3. Then he plays bishop d6, threatening checkmate on h2. So white pushes his f-pawn, cutting the bishop off. Black's g5 piles up on the pinned pawn, but white counters with e5, attacking the bishop, who drops to e7. Magnus follows with knight d2, planning a maneuver towards weak squares in black's camp. Black pushes his g-pawn, preparing more threats on the white king, but white has no fear as he jumps his knight into the center. Black, realizing the power of white's advanced central pawn, tries to fight back with f6. White holds firm, jumping his knight onto d6 with check. Now, the bishop should probably take the knight, but it would give white a commanding thorn pawn on d6 and an open e-file, which he would soon make use of. So black sidesteps his king to f8. White develops his final minor piece with bishop d2, and black brings his knight out to h6. Magnus activates his queen onto e2 in anticipation of the opening of the e-file, and after black's g3 threatening another checkmate on h2, white calmly pushes his pawn, closing the kingside. Black turns to the other end of the board as he pushes a5, threatening to trap the white bishop. White pushes a4, stopping that, and black, not wanting white to get the semi-open a-file, closes down the queenside with b4. Now black could play f5 at some point, which would stop the e-file from opening up anytime soon. So white pushes f5 himself, guaranteeing an open e-file at some point. Black shifts his rook over to g8, preparing to defend his 7th rank laterally, and white brings his final piece into the action with rook a to e1. After black lifts his rook to g7, white snatches the pawn on f6, attacking the bishop and rook. Now black should take the pawn with his queen, but white would play knight e4, which would kick the queen back to h4 before white would play f6, which would fork the bishop and rook again. So black jumps his knight to g4, maybe hoping white would fall asleep at the board. But unfortunately for him, white actually has a wonderful way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 6? White already has full control over the open e-file, and his plan will involve opening the f-file as well to get at the black king. The move Magnus plays to finish the game up is pawn takes g7. Black's only move is to recapture the pawn, and white pushes f6. Now, to force the longest possible checkmate, black should take the pawn with the queen. White would take the knight on g4 with check, and black would block with the queen again. Before white would take the bishop on e7, pushing the king to h8. Then white would take the pawn on d4, and black would have to block the check with the queen before white would take it with checkmate. Back to the game. Instead, black takes the pawn with the bishop, hoping to avoid substantial material loss, but all this does is make checkmate come faster. Magnus jumps his knight to f5, giving the black king 3 options, but it wouldn't matter which it would choose, and in this case it's f8. White's final move would be the same for each possibility, and that is queen e8 checkmate. The third opponent is Lake Monster, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with knight f6 attacking the e4 pawn. Magnus castles, and he meets knight takes e4 with d4, hoping for a capture so that he can pin the knight to the king. Black drops the knight back to d6 instead, attacking the bishop, and white counters with bishop g5, attacking black's queen. Now black could play f6. White would take the pawn on e5, hitting the knight, and were it to take the bishop, white would take again on f6, and after black would recapture with the pawn, white would check the king with rook e1. The bishop shouldn't block because white would be able to take on f3 thanks to the pin. So, instead, the king would go to f7, after which white could check again with queen d5. Now this line goes on, but the idea is that things could get dangerous for the black king, even though it could be possible for black to keep the extra piece. Instead of all of this, black just blocks with bishop e7, and white exchanges bishops, leading to the knight landing on e7. Magnus regains the pawn by capturing on e5 with an attack on the knight, who takes the bishop on b5. White doesn't lose a piece though, since he has the move a4, and we notice that the knight is trapped. After black castles, white takes the knight, equalizing material while getting the semi-open a-file. Black goes after the e5 pawn with knight g6, and white develops his knight to c3. Black's b6 prepares to fianchetto the bishop, but white makes use of the open diagonal, jumping his queen to d5, where she attacks the rook. Black can't really move it because it would hang the a7 pawn, so he blocks with c6. This allows white to win a pawn by capturing once, and after black recaptures, he can take the pawn with his queen. Black follows by developing his bishop to e6 before white slides his rook from a to d1, attacking the queen, who sidesteps to c8, offering an exchange to her counterpart. Magnus, unsatisfied with a mere pawn advantage, drops the queen to e4. Black attacks her with bishop f5, and she ducks to e3. Black lifts his queen to b7, peering at the enemy kingside while connecting the rooks, and white jumps his knight to d4, hitting the bishop, who retreats to safety on e6. White presses on with f4, threatening a fork with f5. So black gets his bishop out of the way, moving it to c4, where it hits the rook, who sidesteps to e1. In anticipation of f5, black drops the knight to e7, planning to reroute it towards the center, and white follows with f5, only one step away from the black kingside. Black's knight d5 attacks the queen, so white takes it, and black recaptures with the bishop, creating a battery aimed at the g2 pawn. Magnus leaves it up for grabs as he plays f6, making first contact with the black king's shelter. Now, black's position is already too far gone. White's going to continue with a move like queen g5, threatening checkmate, and there's pretty much no way for black to defend without losing material. In the game, black just captures the pawn on f6, and this gives white a remarkable way to finish things up. Can you find the checkmate in 4? The queen and knight are a potent pair, and they are all that's needed to checkmate the black king. The move Magnus plays to start his combination is knight f5. This move attacks the g7 square, and the threat is queen g3 check, followed by queen g7 checkmate. There's no way for black to stop this, except king h8 getting off the g-file. Since queen g3 is no longer a check, white advances his queen to h6, threatening both queen g7, checkmate, and queen takes f6. Black stops the greater of the two threats with rook g8, and white takes on f6 with check, forcing the rook to block. The final move is queen takes g7 checkmate. The fourth opponent is Super Grandmaster Sergei Karyakin, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with knight f6. Magnus defends his pawn with d3, and black plays bishop c5, pressuring the soft f2 point. At this moment, white decides to capture the knight, slightly damaging black's pawn structure after he recaptures. Now white cannot take the undefended e5 pawn, because black would reply with queen d4, threatening the knight, and checkmate on f2. So, white proceeds development with knight c3 and black castles. White contests the black bishop's diagonal with bishop e3, and black drops it back to d6, defending his pawn. Then white moves his bishop again to g5, this time pinning the knight to its queen. Black shifts his rook to e8, and after white plays h3, stopping the black minor pieces from getting to g4, black pushes c5, gaining a firm grasp over the d4 square. This, however, weakens the d5 square, and Magnus immediately jumps his knight to d5, piling up on black's pinned knight. Black drops his bishop back to e7 defending, and white takes the bishop before the queen recaptures. Then white castles, and black plays h6, asking the question to the white bishop, who drops to e3, pressuring the c5 pawn. Now black realizes that his knight doesn't really have any options from its current square. So he begins a maneuver towards new horizons. White also drops his knight, but his intention is making way for the f-pawn's advance. Black carries on his maneuver, and white fires his f-pawn forward. Black doesn't want to allow white to gain more space, so he takes the pawn, and after the rook recaptures, black brings his knight out to c6. Magnus, in aggressive fashion, jumps his queen to h5, pressuring f7 and opening the lane for the other rook to double up on the f-file. Black defends his c-pawn with b6 so that his queen isn't stuck defending the pawn. And white swings his other rook over from a to f1, adding a third attacker onto f7. Black defends with rook f8, and white advances his knight to f3, looking to reintegrate it into the attack. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop e6, solidifying the f7 pawn. White slides his rook over to h4, planning to sacrifice the bishop on h6 to break open the kingside and get a potent attack along the h-file. Black finds the only move that defends, f6, planning to meet bishop takes h6 with a recapture, and after the queen would take the pawn, black could move his queen to g7, which would defend all the squares along the h-file. Instead, Magnus slots his queen into the opened g6 square, threatening to exploit the pin on the pawn to the king by capturing on h6. Black shifts his queen to f7, offering an exchange, but white declines, dropping his queen to g3. White's still threatening the pawn on h6, and black should probably do something about it, like pushing the pawn to h5. But he decides to counter with knight b4, attacking the c2 pawn. Magnus obliges, taking the pawn on h6 with his bishop, and black takes the pawn on c2. Then white plays the clever knight e5, attacking the queen, while making use of the pin on the pawn to the queen. Now black's queen is stuck defending checkmate on g7, so the only place it could move to would be e7. But things may become dangerous after knight g6, which would push the queen again, before white would move the bishop, and then jump his rook into h8 with check. To avoid this, black decides to take the knight, allowing white to take the queen with the rook before he recaptures with his own rook. Black just got a knight and a rook for the queen, which is only a slight material deficit, but he was able to slow down white's attack. Or so he thinks. Magnus advances his queen to g6, attacking the bishop, who proceeds to capture the pawn on a2. Then white moves his bishop to g5, covering the e7 square, so that his threat is a checkmate in 2, starting with queen h7, which would push the king to f8 before he would play queen h8 with checkmate. Black stops this by moving the rook to f8, giving the king an escape route. But really, black's position was already lost several moves ago, and white has an amazing way to win here. Can you find white's checkmate in 5? With 3 white pieces attacking and only 1 black piece around to defend, it's no surprise that checkmate is nearby. The move Magnus plays to start things off is rook h7, threatening checkmate on g7. Now black could buy himself 1 extra move by checking the king on f1, and the king would dodge before the rook would have to return to f7 defending. Instead, black just plays rook f7 immediately. Then white plays bishop f6, adding an attacker to the pawn, and black, seeing no way out, resigns the game. Black just can't do anything to stop what's coming. Seriously, whatever he plays, white, say knight d4, white would take on g7 with the rook. Were the black rook to recapture, then queen takes g7 would be checkmate. Were the king to go to f8, then rook g8 would be checkmate. Finally, were the king to go to h8, then rook takes f7 would be a nice checkmate. The fifth opponent is Grandmaster Laurent Fressinet, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with a6. Magnus drops the bishop back to a4, keeping an eye on the knight, and black develops his knight to f6, attacking e4. White castles, leaving the pawn on e4 free to take, which black grabs with his knight. White follows with d4, trying to open the e-file so he can pin the knight to the king. Black inserts b5, kicking the bishop back to b3 before playing d5 to support his knight in the center. This allows white to take back the pawn on e5, opening a second attacker, namely the queen, onto the d5 pawn. Black defends it with bishop e6, and white challenges black's advanced knight, moving his own from b to d2. After black develops his bishop to c5, preparing to castle, white plays c3, opening the square for his bishop to build up pressure on the knight, and white castles his king to safety. Magnus drops his bishop to c2, threatening to take twice on e4. So black moves his bishop to f5, defending. White follows with knight b3, threatening to take the bishop on c5, and after black's knight would recapture, white could take the hanging bishop on behind it. So black drops his bishop to g6 so that it's defended. White jumps his other knight from f to d4, attacking the knight on c6, and black takes it with his bishop. White recaptures with the pawn, solidifying his advanced e-pawn, and black pushes a5, gaining space on the queen side. In anticipation of a4, kicking the knight, white quickly gets his bishop out so that after black's a4, which comes next, white can drop his knight to d2 without blocking in his bishop. Black continues with f6, challenging white's central space advantage, and while white could support his pawn with f5, moving the f-pawn 2 squares would mean he could never kick the knight on e4 with his pawn. So he decides to capture the pawn on f6, and the queen recaptures. Magnus slides his rook to the semi-open c-file, and black moves his rook from a to e8. White initiates a series of exchanges, first capturing the knight with his knight. Black takes back with his bishop, and after white takes again, black recaptures with the rook. Then white lifts his queen to d3, attacking b5, and defending his bishop so that he can safely play f3 to kick the rook. Now black could take the pawn on d4 here with his knight, but white would play f3, kicking the rook, who would have to stay on the 4th rank to defend the knight, so it would move to h4. Then white would play bishop f2, pushing the rook to f4 before he would play rook f to d1, forcing the knight back, after which he would take the pawn on b5, equalizing material, but white would have a slightly more active position. Instead of all of this, black just shifts the king to the corner, getting out of any potential checks along the diagonal. Magnus continues with, as you saw, f3, kicking the rook back to e6. Then he tucks his bishop into f2, and black advances his queen to f4, drawing near the enemy king while defending his c7 pawn. White moves his rook from f to d1, reinforcing the defense of his d-pawn so that his queen can move freely, and black swings his rook over to b8, defending the b-pawn. White's rook springs to c5, attacking both b5 and d5, and there's just not much black can do about this. He jumps his knight to b4, counterattacking the white queen, and white cleverly takes the pawn on b5, threatening to take the black rook with a back rank checkmate. Black plays c6, thinking his queen is defending the rook, which is true, but he's made a terrible mistake, and white has an incredible move to win the game. Can you find white's one and only winning move? To find the move, one must notice that the queen and rook are both loose. The move Magnus plays that probably nobody except for him saw coming is queen f5, and black immediately resigns. There's just nothing he can do. His queen absolutely cannot leave the defense of his rook on the back rank without hanging checkmate, and white's simply threatening to take her on the next move. Even if the queen were to move on the diagonal, defending the rook, or the rook were to move and defend the queen, white would just take the other rook, gaining a decisive material advantage. It's just all over for black. The penultimate opponent is international master Khazar Babazadeh, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with a6. White drops the bishop back to a4 before black plays d6, solidifying his e-pawn. White plays c3, preparing a central advance, and black develops his bishop to d7, breaking the pin on his knight. White strikes with d4, and black maintains the tension as he brings out his knight, attacking the pawn on e4. White castles, and black could take the pawn on e4, but white would follow with rook e1, which would kick the knight back to f6 before he would take the knight on c6, and then would capture twice on e5 to win back the pawn. Instead, black just develops his bishop to e7, and white shifts his rook to e1. Black castles, and white plays h3, stopping black's bishop from pinning his knight. Black pushes b5, kicking white's bishop back to c2 before he captures the pawn on d4. Magnus recaptures, getting a powerful central pawn duo, but with no more c-pawn, black can jump his knight to b4, tickling the bishop while paving the lane for his c-pawn's advance. The bishop dodges to b3 and black strikes with c5. White pushes a3, kicking the knight back to c6 before he develops his knight to c3. Black pushes c4, attacking the bishop, and it drops to c2. Now white has great control over the center, whereas black's advantage is on the queen side. Black should focus his efforts on that side of the board with moves like b4 or rook b8. Instead, he plays g6, planning to shift his rook and reroute his bishop to g7. White advances in the center with d5, and black unfortunately is forced to either retreat his knight or move it to passivity on the rim. Instead, he jumps it to e5, which is a mistake, as white has a way to win. Can you find white's only winning move? The bishop on e7 is cut off in every direction, and there's a tactic here to take advantage of that. The move Magnus plays to win the game is knight takes e5, and black, realizing there's no way to save face, resigns. If black doesn't take the knight back, then white just won a full piece. Otherwise, the capture would allow white to push d6, trapping the bishop on e7. White would win that piece regardless of what black would play next, and he would gain a decisive material advantage. The final opponent is Grandmaster Sergei Grigorians, and he meets the Ruy Lopez with a6. Magnus drops his bishop back to a4, and black develops his knight to f6, attacking e4. White defends with d3, and black plays bishop c5, pressuring the frail f2 pawn. White pushes c3, opening the square for his bishop, while having a long-term plan of pushing d4. After black's b5, white drops the bishop to b3 for now. Black plays d6, solidifying his center, and white swoops his bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Black's h6 asks the question to the bishop, who retreats to h4, maintaining the pin. Black drops his bishop to b6, where it is a little less vulnerable to attack, and white develops his knight from b to d2. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop e6, and then both sides castle their kings to safety, setting the stage for the middle game. Magnus shifts his rook to e1, and black moves his king to the corner, planning to move his rook to g8 in order to launch his g-pawn. White strikes on the other end with a4, trying to get an open a-file. Now black doesn't want to leave his rook on a8 because white would take on b5, and after black would recapture, white would exchange rooks, which would force the queen away from the defense of his knight. Then white could take the knight with the bishop, which would damage black's kingside pawn structure after he would recapture. So black shifts his rook to b8, and then white drops his knight to f1, looking to maneuver it towards more active squares. Black carries on with his plan of rook g8. Magnus takes the pawn on b5, getting the open a-file for his rook after black recaptures. Then he jumps his knight to e3, eyeing up weak squares in the center. Black lunges with the g-pawn, hitting the bishop, who drops back to g3. He lifts his queen to d7, connecting the rooks, and white drops his bishop back to c2, since it will be better placed there after he would play d4, which would open things up in the center. Black jumps his knight to g4, trying to exchange knights, but really this leaves the d5 square with one less defender, and white hops his own knight there. Black doesn't want to lose his strong dark squared bishop, so he captures the knight, and white recaptures with the pawn, hitting black's knight. Black drops it to e7, counterattacking white's pawn. Magnus ignores this, striking with d4. Black takes the pawn and white recaptures with the knight. Now black's best bet here is to drop his knight back to f6, going after white's advanced d-pawn. White would carry on with moves like h4 or queen d3 to build up an attack on black's vulnerable king. Instead, black plays knight g6, which is a big mistake, as white now has a fantastic move to win. Can you find white's winning move? The knight on e7 had a crucial responsibility of defending the f5 square, and with the queen and knight on the same diagonal, there is a tactic. The move Magnus plays to win the game is bishop f5, and black, realizing he's going to lose material, resigns. The queen and knight are both under attack, and there's no way to save both. Black would have to choose his queen, after which white would pick up the knight, gaining a decisive material advantage. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.